Hello, this is Chris Douglas, and we are now in part 7 of my ongoing series, AngularJS and SharePoint. In the previous video, we went really long and we only looked at 2 components. In this part, I hope to look through the remainder of the components and wrap up the series. We shall see. Here is our PowerPoint slide again. As you see, all that we have left is Display and Edit.html and Cigars.Items.js. We will do our best to get through these remaining 3 components in this current video. Here is our Display.html web page. As you can see, it's just a table. It is really pretty straightforward. We define our field and then we refer to the variable from inside Angular. The VIM manufacturer is coming from the controller, and we have title, strength, size. As you see, pretty much the display is very straightforward. Here down at the bottom we have our buttons, which allow us to close and edit. They have a command close.click and command edit.click. So again, other than having to hardwire the fields into the form, it's really about the simplest part of this application. Not a lot to do, but that's it for the display. Let's go ahead and look at edit. Very similar layout. We have manufacturer again in the same location, but this time we're going to have, like in this case, a text field that's going to be associated with VIM manufacturer. And here, in order to capture the enter button, as I mentioned in the previous video, the enter key screws things up. So just to handle that, we put in this key press method to capture the enter click, and all that's going to do is throw it away. We're not doing any kind of search. We're not doing anything with the enter key. We're just catching it and throwing it away. So title, very similar. Looks at title, strength, size, shape, origin. All of these are basically the same. And down at the bottom, we've got cancel and save events tied to those buttons. So as you can see, display and edit, very straightforward. New just uses the same edit.html file, and all of the work is really going on in the JS file, which we'll look at in a second. But couldn't it be more straightforward? You just lay out the form the way you want the fields to appear. For this demo, all of my fields are text fields. So in a later video, I'll explain what to do if you have other SharePoint fields that you want to use, such as choice fields and lookup fields. There are other ways to handle those. I kept this as simple as possible. Every field is treated as a text field, and it will save the entry as text. It'll save it even though some of these are, say, choice fields. So there might be some errors involved if you were to use this technique on a non-string-based field, but I wanted to keep the example as simple as possible. So here is our Cigars.Item.js file. We're defining our item controller in the same way we define the list controller. We have the directives, almost the same directives we're using here. You notice there's some that we're not using, so we didn't even reference them here. We're setting VM equal to this so that we know that we're associating the alias VM with the item controller. We're going to go ahead and jump down to the bottom here. Okay, and as we mentioned with the list controller, the code is just going to drop past all of the functions and events and just call them when they're needed. So it's going to actually start running the code here. Route.current.new is referencing a route variable that we've defined in our routing. And so if new is true, vm.new is going to be true. And then the list URL is similar to what we've seen before. That's getting the cigars list and making that URL available for our HTTP calls. And then we're going to call getListItem. GetListItem is going to load either an empty list item if new is true, or it's going to take the list item ID variable that was passed in from the fragment identifier, and it's going to populate one list item. We have a then function because getListItem is returning a promise, and you see this is very common in Angular. If you're calling a method that returns a promise, it's asynchronous. It's not going to move on until that method returns the promise, which means our code hits here and then it goes right to here and it's done. The processing is not held up, but anything within the then is only going to be called once this process completes. So this is how you handle asynchronous calls. Is you call a method that returns a promise and you put in a then statement, so everything you want to happen after the then statement, after the promise returns, you put inside the then statement. And we can see there are places where you would see chained promises, where I'd call this method and then call another method and then call another method, and each one only fires after the previous method returns a promise. So that's a way to make sure that you backload all of your supporting lists for your application. Make sure all of that is already loaded before you move on to the meat of your application. And then we have a show error method, which is very similar to the one in the list control. And we're going to walk up a little bit and we're going to take a look at the events. There's enter click, as I mentioned. You saw in the Edit.html file, if the user clicks enter, we're just capturing the prevent default and throwing it away. So that prevents the enter key from screwing up your SharePoint page. Edit click is called when the user hits the edit button from the display page. And again, we're setting the window location.href. So what this does is we're building a new fragment identifier. We're setting it equal to #edit. We're going to pass in the list item ID, which is the unique identifier from the SharePoint list for the item we want. And then we have a slash, and then we have route param search, which is our search criteria. That's optional. So that if route param search is empty, it's going to put in undefined. You remember earlier we were checking to see if it was null or undefined. If it's empty, search has to return something, so it's going to be /undefined. So this, again, is how you see here, all three of these, we just set the href, all four of these. You set the href property and a different fragment identifier, and that's how we easily move from one application, one form to another within the application. So once you understand this process, it's very straightforward to navigate through your application. Close is just going to go back to the main list, so it's just # and the search. Save is going to call edit list item, which is going to save the list item to the SharePoint list. And again, that's waiting on a promise. When it's done, the then will call the redirect to the search, which means if there's an error here, it's going to throw an error and it'll stay on the page and not leave. But it's not going to do anything until the save is complete. And when the save is complete, it's going to redirect back to the list. Cancel, of course, just like close, just calls the list, basically defaults back to the list control and passes in the search. We could probably combine command close and command cancel into one event since they're doing essentially the same thing. All right, and we're going to move up to the top here. We're going to look at edit list item. Okay, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to do another video. I'm going to explain how the REST API works. But basically, we need to build a data object. It is a cigars list item. And we're passing in the values for this data object. You know, the property of manufacturer is equal to VM manufacturer. So you notice in my code, I'm only dealing with one list item, right? I could make my variables be vm.item.manufacturer and vm.item.title and so on. But I know I'm only dealing with one item. So it's simpler just to say vm.manufacturer is the manufacturer field of the current item that I'm dealing with. When I'm in the list, I'm not dealing with any of these variables. When I'm in the item controller, I'm setting all of these properties based on the SharePoint list item, and they're all just top-level variables. I mean, it's very simple. You would normally wrap this in a class if you were in C# because you're dealing with a lot of different objects. Well, here, it's one page. Its only function is to show a list item or edit a list item. So I just keep it as simple as possible and just call the field gets to be a top-level variable. So we've defined our data object. We then grab our URL/items. And here's our headers that's going to tell the HTTP call what we're doing. Now, if list item ID is not blank, then I'm going to call items and pass in list item ID. So you notice here, by doing this, we don't even have to use the new property. We may not even need new within here. But if the list item ID is not null, then we're changing the URL to account for the list item. So this is going to do a new command or an add command. This is going to do an edit command. And then we just have a simple HTTP call. We're doing a post instead of a get. We're passing in the URL that got built up there. We're passing in the headers that got built up there. And we're stringifying our data object to JSON. So this right here is what saves it back to the SharePoint list. And if there's an error, we're going to wrap it in show error. So we don't need to catch the error in our main because it's going to be handled right here. Okay. Get list item is going to return one item from the SharePoint list. So we're reading the route parameters item ID, and that's defined as the local variable list item ID. If there is no list item ID, it's a new item. We're returning QN. So yeah, it is apparent in looking at this code that I don't need the new value at all because I'm looking to see if list item ID is set, and that tells me it's a new item. So that may solve our problem. We may not need to define the new item, the new property. Okay, so we're calling HTTP. We're calling the get method for our list item ID that's going to return one JSON object that represents a SharePoint list item. It's going to return response, and because we're using JSON, it's nice and easy. Response.data.d is going to be all of the properties of our list item. And here we're just simply saying take manufacturer from D, make it equal to manufacturer within the form. I mean, you can tell by looking at this, it's very obvious what it's doing. If I had any special type of converting of the data here, like taking a date and converting it to a friendly date string, month, day, year, I'd be doing it right here. All right, show error we saw in the previous controller. So that's basically it. We have edit item and get list item. That's it. If you remember the previous, if you attended SharePoint Saturday, I was using CSOM in order to return a list item and to edit a list item, and it was really complicated. Using REST and using HTTP, it simplifies this dramatically. So that's all there is to our application. Okay, well, this concludes part 7 of my series, AngularJS and SharePoint. I didn't realize how long these videos were going to be until I sat down and recorded them, but my goal was to communicate in a most bare bones, straightforward way, starting from scratch, how you can take an Angular application and attach it to a SharePoint list all the items, do a search, bring up individual items, and then edit and save those items as well as add new items to the list. I hope I was successful. I do plan to do more videos to go more in depth on some of the things. Believe it or not, I feel like I summarized and skimmed over a lot of the functionality, but I felt like I needed to explain at least enough so that a new programmer could follow along and take the examples, which I'm going to post online here shortly, and create their own application and follow along and do what I did with Angular. So look forward to seeing you in my next series of videos. Bye now.